thank you so much. First of all, so excited to see so many friends and colleagues and, in fact, former students of mine here. All of you who know me know that there is no possible way that I can live up to that introduction. I feel like I want to sort of cash in my chips now. One of the great things about speaking to adults rather than speaking to ninth graders is that the adults will rarely tell you to your face that you're boring. And I was told that in all kinds of ways as a ninth grade teacher, never more memorably than a student in my first year of teaching, a student named Javier, who very politely raised his hand and patiently waited to be called on and said, "Mr. Shore, could we open the door? It's boring in here." So with that, you might want to look to the doors at some point. I'm going to try not to be boring, and in the interest of not being boring, I may do a few bad things. But I know we opened this afternoon with some words about the excellent harmony between the worlds of the business school and the ed school. And at risk of biting some of the hands that feed me, I want to call out a tension that exists between those worlds. I want to say first that, as Dean Stipek said, I live in both those worlds. And so this is done with both good humor and a lot of love. But at the same time, I need to call out clearly some tensions between those worlds, because without doing that, I can't explain to you fully the rather remarkable moment that we are living in now. And so I want to call that out explicitly, and I hope that it will be taken in the spirit in which it's intended. Those of you who make the journey between the business school and the education school, and I know that many, maybe most of you do, know that you are traveling across an international border with different languages, different cultures, different systems of belief, different values. And those differences, to put them in microcosm, can be expressed as a sort of a mutual curiosity or suspicion. On the business school side, and this comes from what I've learned from my students and what they've written, what I've heard them say, and what I've learned from being in both of these worlds. On the business side, the business folks think that the education types are too nonlinear in their thinking, that they're too fuzzy, that they are using their heart more than their head. On the other side, the education types see the reverse. They bring a wealth of knowledge for the actual practice in classrooms. They know kids and they know communities. They don't feel like that knowledge is properly appreciated and respected. They feel like the folks on the business side bring too much of their head and not enough of their heart. And so we have moments, as happened this week, where McKinsey and Company released a report on the state of the education gap in the United States. And to the several of you who are from McKinsey, I want to say, it's a terrific report. And to those of you from the education world, it's possible that there was a sense of surprise that when a respected business consulting company said that we had a crisis with the education gap, that made headlines. And that when a number was put on it, that we could see the actual impact on the economy, that was what made the education gap a national story. And it's quite significant that David Labrie, a professor at the Education School, in his book, The Trouble with Ed Schools, opens with an example of somebody who wanted to live in both worlds, both in the business school and in the education school. He first wanted to be an MBA student and decided he wasn't qualified and ended up in the ed school. And Professor Labrie writes that the perception was, education, it seems, is just too important and too troubled to be left in the hands of educators who've been ineptly trained by teacher educators in schools of education and whose efforts to deal with school problems have been inaccurately informed by the education researchers. Now, on the other side of this tension, we have a view of the business school world that might be best encapsulated in a story that is sometimes told about consultants. I know many of you are consultants. My sister is one. So this is told with, again, great love, but the story goes like this. A guy in a 5 Series BMW pulls up next to a field where a rancher is tending to his flock of sheep. And he leans out the window and says to the rancher, "If I can tell you exactly how many you have, will you give me one?" And the rancher says, "Sure, all right, why not?" And so the guy in the BMW gets on his laptop, which he has an air card for, and he taps into the NASA satellite imaging of that particular hectare, and he runs it through an image processing software and has it spit out the results to a spreadsheet, which he then receives on his BlackBerry, which is plugged into his mobile microprinter, prints out the result, turns to the rancher and says, "You have exactly 1,586 sheep." The rancher says, "Well, that's right, here you go." And the guy gets out of his car, goes and puts the animal in the trunk. Seems like it's all done. And then the rancher says, "Tell you what, if I can tell you exactly what you do for a living, can I have it back?" And the guy in the BMW says, "Yeah, don't see why not." And the rancher says, "You're a consultant." And the guy says, "Well, that's exactly right. How'd you guess that?" And the rancher says, "I didn't have to guess, I knew." He says, "You turned up here even though nobody called you. You wanted to get paid for an answer I already know to a question that I didn't ask you about a business that you know nothing about. Now, would you give me my dog back?" So, in that tension between those worlds, we have in microcosm what Michael Barone, in a book titled Hard America, Soft America, and I'll give you a hint on which one he favors because the subtitle is Competition versus Coddling in the Battle for the Nation's Future. And he says that the country is divided, and you don't have to agree with this thesis, I don't, but he says that the country is divided into 2 worlds. And one of them is hard, one of them is soft. And one of those lives in a world of competition, and one of those lives in a world that he calls coddling. And this division is paralleled from hard to soft, right to left, Republican to Democrat. And in our world, traditionalist classroom versus constructivist. It's the division between Stephen Colbert and Jon Stewart. between Dunkin' Donuts and Starbucks, between Rush Limbaugh and Rachel Maddow, Darth Vader and Obi-Wan, Dick Cheney and anybody. And we may be able to see a piece of that hard and soft in the competition, or excuse me, in the contrast between the business school and the ed school. This has consequences, and education is caught in the middle of it. The questions of what happens in classrooms, what gets taught and by who is it who gets to reform our schools that aren't working, who is it who gets to decide what working means? All of these live in the tension between hard and soft. And that tension between hard and soft is the reason why No Child Left Behind, which used to be a very beautiful phrase made up by Marianne Wright Edelman of the Children's Defense Fund, has now become America's least popular brand. In our world, it's the tension between tests and portfolios, between data versus diagnostics, between directed education versus child-centered education, between learning the content versus learning how to learn, creative versus scripted teaching, discipline systems versus reason and persuasion. What I want to persuade you of tonight, what I want to argue tonight, is that something's changing. That the labels of hard and soft and all those other pieces that go with them are starting not to fit anymore. And that a new space is being created where those labels are no longer useful, where a new vision is replacing the division. And the question is no longer going to be, what side are you on? But in that new space, what are you going to do? Michael Barone's thesis works like this. On the third page, when he first introduces the term hard and soft, guess where he goes to explain the example? From ages 6 to 18, Americans live mostly in what I call soft America, the parts of our country where there's little competition and accountability. Soft America coddles. Our schools, seeking to instill self-esteem, ban, tag, and dodgeball and promote just about anyone who shows up. Hard America plays for keeps. The private sector fires people when profits fall. Yeah, it was written a little while ago. And the military trains under live fire. What's interesting is that if you open up David Labarie's book, he too agrees with this notion of softness and the left in the education school. He writes, for American education during the 20th century and continuing into the present, the progressive vision has become canonical, serving as the definition of good teaching. In these institutions, the purpose of teacher education programs and teacher professional development programs is framed as an effort to dissuade teachers from adopting the traditional approach and enlist them firmly within the progressive cause. And he goes on to say, he himself adopts the term soft as well and says, disciplines seen as producing hard knowledge are those that are most successful in establishing the rhetorical claim. Their research findings are verifiable, definitive, and cumulative. Education emerges as the softest of soft fields of inquiry. So we have this critique from Michael Barone and the right. And yet, there's a critique on the other side too, that if the world of the ed school is too soft, that the world of the B school is too hard. And particularly over the last year with the financial crisis, we've seen a lot of criticism and frankly, more humility among my colleagues in the business world. New York Times wrote recently, critics of business education have many complaints. Some say the schools have become too scientific, too detached from real world causes. Others say students are taught to come up with hasty solutions to complicated problems. And a blog at the Harvard Business School says, business schools provide students with many technical skills, but they appear to do little or nothing to foster responsibility and accountability. Society implicitly trusted MBAs to do no harm when it allowed financial markets to operate in a relatively unregulated fashion, but its faith has been betrayed. As a result, there's an active distrust of business schools and their graduates. For people in education, they look at the influx of folks from the business school world and say, you don't understand the context. So when in Oakland, the analysis was, wow, we have these under-enrolled, low-performing schools that are wasting a tremendous amount of money and delivering very little value to kids. We got to close them. From a business standpoint, that was an incredibly clear decision. It didn't factor in the understanding that for parts of this community, this public institution was what this neighborhood owned. There was a lack of understanding of the impact of taking away something that people felt was theirs, and there was a lack of understanding of what it would mean to go to school in another neighborhood, particularly if that neighborhood might be across gang lines. It's exactly the same thing that we've seen with Michelle Rhee in Washington, D.C., where people from within the education world have said, you come from the outside, you don't understand, you don't know the context. And we end up with these two different languages. It would be possible to look at this situation and say, okay, so the battle is between hard and soft, and right now, hard is winning. NCLB, sorry, No Child Left Behind, I get caught in our own jargon. Restructuring, the enormous increase on the emphasis on standardized testing, privatization as a solution for the problems of low-income schools, the innovation funds in the stimulus and the degree to which those are now likely to be directed toward private organizations, the fascinating entity of the Broad residency in education and specific business education for young newcomers to take high-level positions in districts, and the idea that for many of the problems that we face in education, that entrepreneurs, a word that was, I think, unknown when I entered education a long time ago, is now a really commonplace concept. And last week, following up on the McKinsey report, Tom Friedman in the New York Times connected all those dots and said, okay, so here's this report that says that the impact of the achievement gap in this country is $525 billion of productivity. And went on to say that Teach for America is the solution, or at least a big part of it. And he writes, Wendy Kopp, the founder of Teach for America, called the other day with these statistics about college graduates signing up to join her organization to teach in some of our neediest schools. Our total applications are up 40%. 11% of all Ivy League seniors applied. 16% of Yale's senior class, 15% of Princeton's, and so on. My experience coming into education really showed me that we were living in a world of hard and soft. As Dean Stipek said, I came in the first year of Teach for America. I've been told I'm not allowed to make any jokes about how old that made me. So I will just tell you the story of how one afternoon when I got back from class, there was a paper that had been slid under my door that had been printed on a dot matrix printer and mimeographed, saying that there was this opportunity to join this new program started by a Princeton undergraduate, and in a way that was quite foreign in education, numbers driven from the very start, in a way that is now essential to the accountability revolution. It was a private organization with partnerships and support from major industry. Union Carbide was the primary supporter of Teach for America when it got started. And frankly, a somewhat uncomfortable marriage between Teach for America and the ed schools that became the sort of the other half of getting teacher credentials. My Florida International University paper on my wall is a testament to that. And oddly enough, ended up through Teach for America teaching in a school that belongs to the Coalition of Essential Schools. For those of you who that doesn't mean much, that's the organization that was founded and led by Ted Sizer, who came to our school and helped me to learn to be a teacher. It is in this soft-hard dynamic, it is the softest of the soft side. And so somehow I was living in this world between Teach for America and the Coalition of Essential Schools. I didn't know hard from soft. I didn't know constructivist from traditionalist. What I did know was that there were raging battles between the people who said, we really have to find a way to get our kids to be competitive in a way that they are not today, and the people who said, you don't understand that what they've gone through just to show up. And you can't ask them, you can't grade them on homework because you don't understand it's too much for them to do homework. And there was a raging battle going on in that school, and I'm sure so many schools like it. Cut to several years later, when I became a journalist, and after several years writing for different newspapers, decided to write a book about this then new idea called charter schools. It was a fascinating collision of political opposites. I was writing about an organization called Oakland Community Organizations, pretty much as far to the soft side as you can go. A Saul Alinsky-inspired industrial areas foundation, community organizing, power building organization that really fought for grassroots interests through churches in the low-income neighborhoods of Oakland. And what they decided to do was, they wanted to start a group of small schools based on the idea of Debbie Meyer, which again, from the Coalition of Essential Schools, was very much to the soft side. They realized they weren't getting any traction getting the Oakland School District to allow them to do this. And so what they did was use charter schools as a lever to make it happen. The place they visited was a school in New York, that they gave them the inspiration to do this, was a school in New York called KIPP, which nowadays, now that KIPP is not 2 schools as it was then, but now more than 60, is now seen as sort of the hard side of education. And in that moment, visiting this KIPP classroom, this collision between hard and soft became clear. These were teachers who wanted nothing more than to give their kids a shot. And what they were doing, and what I found so inspiring, was walking into the classroom of a teacher named Frank Corcoran and seeing him stop for 20 minutes to have a conversation about bringing materials to class. Not because he wanted to lecture somebody about bringing materials to class, but because he understood the distance between where the kids had arrived and where they would need to be if they were going to be competitive in college. And what I realized was that he was telling the truth where the schools that I had spent so much time in were lying. Because the story that the schools I had been in were telling was, okay, so you're at this school, which is not a great school, and you have a C, and you don't do most of your homework, but you can definitely be a doctor. That was a lie. What Frank Corcoran was telling his kids was, it's going to take exactly this much work to get from where you are now to that place. You can get there, but it's going to take an unbelievable amount of work. Coming to school 10 hours a day, 6 days a week, many more days a year than most kids do. He was telling them the truth. And this was where hard and soft intersected. And I went back to Oakland and I wrote a story about these charter schools, which were started again by this very lefty community group and funded by John Walton, the son of Sam Walton of Walmart, who was an arch conservative, and who I talked to, and I said, why are you putting millions of dollars into the creation of charter schools? And if there was anything but honesty in what he said, I couldn't detect it. And I'll remind you, I'd been a journalist for a lot of years at that point. He said, this is the biggest problem this country has. In his highly conservative view of the world, the flaw in the system was that there isn't equal opportunity in this country. And it's because of schools. And he was determined to find a way to change that. His conservative belief that hard work and opportunity should earn you a good place in this country was getting messed up by the quality of schools in low-income communities. And that intersection, that crashing of meeting people from a very different place on the political spectrum from oneself in inner city schools, started happening more and more. Very strange bedfellows, all passionate about the education of low-income kids. And we started to see it through No Child Left Behind, and we started to see it through people having a very complicated relationship between the left and unions, particularly, or I should say specifically, teachers' unions. And it came to a head, and we can put a day and an hour to the turning point moment in this story. It happened in Denver on the Monday before the Democratic Convention at which Barack Obama was nominated. It was an event that, had it been held 4 or 8 or 12 years earlier, would have maybe drawn 5 or 10 people on education policy in the Democratic Party. There were 500 people there. It was standing room only. Mayor Cory Booker of Newark, Mayor Adrian Fenty from Washington, D.C., Governor Roy Romer, Joel Klein from New York City were sitting shoulder to shoulder on a panel as they described the discomfort that they had being Democrats and being passionate about the education of low-income kids. And it reached its ultimate moment when Cory Booker, who is truly one of the rising young stars of the Democratic Party, described this as a battle at the heart, I'm quoting him, a battle at the heart of the Democratic Party. And he said, as Democrats, we have been wrong on education, and it's time to get right. And this standing room only crowd was cheering. And it was impossible to sit in that crowd and not realize that something had changed in a truly profound way in this country. That was followed by the earthquake of Barack Obama's campaign and election. And Barack Obama has made very clear that he rejects tired dualities from the past. He has said, we need to move beyond the same debate we've been having for the past 30 years when we haven't gotten anything done. My sister's a teacher, so I'm a strong supporter of teachers, but I'm not going to be bound by just a certain way of talking about these things in order for us to move forward on behalf of kids. And I think a lot of teachers want to talk about how to continually improve performance. That's not a conservative issue or a liberal issue. And he chose as his Secretary of Education Arne Duncan, who had lived in both of these worlds and who, when presented with this choice, and some of you will be familiar with the choice between the Education Equity Project and the Bigger, Broader, Bolder Coalition, which really could have been seen as the hard and the soft, the people who wanted accountability and the people who said you have to change communities before you can really improve schools. And Duncan had signed both. We're living in a different moment now. For people on the left, one of the defining beliefs has been that you judge the health of your country not by how its most affluent member is doing, but how the least well-off person is doing. If you are passionate about the education of low-income children, you have looked at the positions of the left in this country, and this is exactly what Cory Booker was saying, in at very least, a quite complicated way. And you've found yourself, if you are working passionately on behalf of low-income kids, whichever part of the spectrum you come from, working next to somebody who comes from the opposite side of that spectrum. This is a new space where the labels have stopped applying and where the new question is not which side are you on, but a much more practical question, which is, what's your contribution? What are you doing? It's a time when, like Barack Obama, this country has said, we are tired of the worn out dualities. People from the left and the right, people from the soft and the hard, are engaged together working for low-income kids. All of them understanding that head and heart are both essential to this work, that you have to be capable of both data analysis and love to really do this work. That there is no one or the other, that we have to be willing to both embrace the idea of being held truly accountable for measurable results with children, and being capable of embracing the children themselves. Everybody understands, or ought to, that when we talk about results, it's more than just test scores. There's a lot of work to be done on that front, and I don't want to be Pollyanna about this. This is a change that's starting. It's not a change that's complete. There are a lot of places and a lot of people this hasn't touched yet. But this space of practical possibility is opening. And more, people are learning the same thing that I found so inspiring at KIPP, that to do right by children, we have to both love them and hold high standards. That if we don't do both, we don't understand the difference between love and pity. In this space that's now being created, you have to be both tough-minded and empathetic at the same time. And so I think the question for all of us in this room, whether you are students or whether you are well ensconced in your career, whether you are going to teach or start a company that makes a difference or create a great assessment that really measures critical thinking and really helps us understand how ready kids are to compete in college. Whatever are those things that you're doing, the question for us in this room is no longer which side are you on? The question is, what am I going to do? Thank you.